Welcome to the podcast of the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. Please check the description of this episode for links to the music that the speakers mention.
So welcome to another episode of the History of Science Society's Centennial Podcast, celebrating the upcoming 100th birthday of the History of Science Society and produced in collaboration with the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. I'm Andy Fiss, a member of the HSS Committee on Education and Engagement, and I'm hosting today's episode. Historians of Science United Through Song. We're recording in December. December is often a time for song, from public caroling to festive music. What do songs have to do with the history of science? That's what's really bringing us together. For this episode, our panelists consider examples from various contexts and disciplines, including, ultimately infusing some HSS content into your December playlists and beyond. So there are four of us here today, and to start things off, I'll ask each of you, how did you get interested in songs in the history of science? So, Tony, let's start with you.
Okay, well, hi everybody. I'm Tony Adler. I got interested in the history of song and the history of science because I came to the history of science via maritime history. And maritime history is filled with songs, a lot of working songs. So when I was looking at the history of oceanography, I have come across many examples of songs that were composed on in the cramped spaces aboard various expedition ships, and you just find song and poetry on expeditions in general, and that's how I have come across songs in the history of science.
Great, thank you. So, Asif, now you're next.
Hi, I'm Asif Siddiqi. I'm really excited to be here. I This seemed like a natural merger of two portions of my life: the history of science, which is my profession, and pop music or music in general, which one might call my passion. I was both a musician. I played in lots of bands in college, but I was also a fan, of lots of different types of music. And my work and my passion were largely separate early on in my career. But as a graduate student, I started to get interested as I was writing about the Cold War. And most of my early work was on space science. I was starting to really recognize that there was a kind of record of all of this also in songs about space and so forth. There was one particular song that I really resonated with me when I was a graduate student, which was a song called IGY by Donald Fagen, who was formerly of Steely Dan. And IGY, of course, stands for the International Geophysical Year. So that song very beautifully captured what I was trying to get at in my text, the kind of feeling of that moment of the late 1950s when global science and technology seemed to envision a kind of new and bright future for humanity, a kind of moment of optimism. And that song really sort of resonated partly because it got to the essence of something that I was not really successful to get at in my writing. So it kind of clued me in to the fact that there were other ways to really historicize and think about history than the sort of dry, and the history of science in particular, than the dry sort of archival based argumentative writing, and that there was some way in which aesthetics had a place in all of this. So that's really my sort of open-ended entry into all of this.
Great, thank you. And now, Betty, we turn to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm also excited to be here with you today, especially since I don't know any of you. It's an opportunity for to get a little bit outside of your conventional discipline or subdiscipline or whatever. I'm Betty Smocovitis. I'm at the University of Florida. I have a long-standing interest in the history of evolution and evolutionary biology. And I guess, it starts with graduate training and training with L. Pierce Williams, who used all kinds of different cultural expressions in teaching the history of science. So, we would read poetry, we would look at images, art history, when we were studying, Isaac Newton, or especially, some areas are richer than others. For example, geology has all these visual images and paintings in particular. So I think it's, this, I was taught at Cornell, or rather, I unlearned all kinds of things so that I could see these connections where people told me they didn't exist. So science and art, and what does it have to do with music, as Andy says, and the permission to do that, because I think we're not encouraged, at least my generation, let's just say I'm an older generation now, just was actively discouraged to see a lot of these connections. This is, I go back to the late 1980s. But what gave me permission was my interest in the history of modern evolutionary biology as a discipline, the evolutionary synthesis, and this volume here by Saul Tax. I don't know if you can see it. It's time for show and tell, and that had been sitting like on my thesis advisor's shelf since probably 1960 when it came out, Saul Tax's Issues in Evolution. And if you look inside, it's volume 3, the one that nobody ever reads. And it's got all these images from the Darwin Centennial of 1959. And if you look closely, here's this musical production of Darwin's life. And I went in the archives, I think about 1993, and I said, let me look at the archives at the University of Chicago. And lo and behold, I pull up stuff like this, right? Music sheets, librettos, and all kinds of hysterical, by that I mean funny shenanigans. And I said, what does this have to do with Darwin? And hence, the opportunity, I think. I felt, and actually I didn't even have tenure at the time. So I took a kind of a risk in going off in this direction. But since then, I've incorporated music in my teaching, especially in my teaching, wherever I can.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. So just um, yeah, a lot of that resonated with me too, in terms of thinking about different ways of coming upon songs sort of suddenly. So I'm in technical communication, which includes science communication at Michigan Technological University. And while I was still before tenure, I also started publishing about some things, and especially history of math and history of the mathematical sciences in the US, having to do with some of the unexpected things that I was finding in the archives that were kind of similar. So, in terms of show and tell, this is the cover of a libretto from an 1886 student production from Vassar College. They called it the Mathematicado, and it was a student production about math that they came up with that was a parody of the Mikado, a really elaborate, fairly faithful parody. And finding that document really inspired a lot of other sort of searching around other institutional archives for similar kinds of things, which exist in a lot of different places. And and then that also sort of led for me into people occasionally sending me things like I uh, was sent by my dissertation advisor the not sure History and Philosophy of Science songbook, which is from 1985. So that was returned to the department I graduated from at Indiana University after an emeritus professor passed away, and because my dissertation advisor knew that I was interested in these kinds of topics, he ended up sort of packing it up and sending it off to me. So it's sort of surprising how we end up finding connections to these kinds of things from unexpected places. Um, so moving on to another question. So Asif, you were already talking about this a little bit, but could you talk maybe a little bit more about sort of how maybe a love of music might feature in this work? How you were talking about it in terms of like a passion that you had already?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. definitely love of music has featured in all of this. Um, I do think that the way I was thinking about music, there's two ways that I was really thinking about as a historian of science. One is the song or songs itself as a kind of archive for us historians, where the song tells us something interesting about a particular moment in the history of science. Um, but the other mode is the song itself as an object of study. As a historian of science, what can we bring to bear on understanding this particular sonic object, that sort of thing. And a lot of my work has been in the latter kind of domain. Um, and, and to go back to the question about the love of music, recently I did edit a book on the history of the pop song and the form of the pop song, bringing together like 16 writers to weigh in on a single song in the history of modern pop. And the book, which is called One Track Mind, was a kind of scholarly excavation of the deep history of pop. But it was also a work of fandom and love, which is where that comes in. Because we all came to this topic through particular songs we loved, and we wrote individual essays on each song, sort of a deep dive of those. And they cover everything from the early 60s to the early 21st century. But I do want to sort of point out that this issue of the love of music, I want to maybe underscore that much like historians of any art form, including art historians or film historians, I think it's perhaps important to maintain some critical distance. As a historian of science, the production and constitution of knowledge and all its sort of different registers and social, political, otherwise is the things that we study as historians of science. I'm not sure how many of us are coming at the history of science because, to echo the question you asked, we love science. So I think in a similar way, I wonder if asking that question, whether we love the song or as songs, is itself a way to suggest maybe that, very gently, that our position as fans might get in the way of our scholarship. It's just a question I'm throwing out there. And I'll admit, the example that I have in that essay, in that book, One Track Mind, which I edited, my essay was on a song called Paper Planes, which was by a British rap star, MIA, which I loved quite a bit when it came out in 2007. And her song itself was based on a sample by an old Clash song. So I was really drawn to it because of the history of sampling. But as a historian of science, I drew from the work of, Trevor Pinch and Holger Schulze and many others, Karen Bisterveld, to really think through the ways in which the use of sampling, digital sampling and other instruments, how music operates between the space between aesthetics and acoustics, by which I mean the former aesthetics, kind of a notion of feeling, and acoustics, where it's more like a scientific object being manipulated through tools and so forth. So it really gave me an appreciation for the compositional skills of people who are working in music these days with very advanced equipment, who are working as much as in the domain of maybe art as the domain of maybe technoscience or some other thing. So I think in that way, my love for the song was maybe deepened, but I also had a more intellectual, abstract, and understanding of the song itself. So I think the sort of conclusion of that is that, yes, I love the song, but maybe the more I study it, maybe it puts me in a different spot than love. I'm not sure what it is, but it does take me away from the love in some fashion.
Yeah, interesting. I think that we'll probably return back to some of those questions of things like thinking about critical distance and definitely thinking about sampling in a little bit. But Betty, I was wondering if you wanted to respond.
Well, it didn't. It really doesn't apply to me so much because it wasn't the love of a song that brought me into this. I explored not one song but multiple songs as a way of getting at communities. And I confess, I was really surprised when I began to look at evolution, Darwin, and all kinds of related areas, ideas like, for example, missing links and so on, and the diversity of communities. In fact, I would even say at this point, find me a community that doesn't create some kind of musical expression, engaging Darwin and evolution, because I saw it everywhere, starting almost immediately from the publication of On the Origin of Species, like late 19th century. And although my research is not global, I mainly stuck to English language sources, what was, literally available to me. I think it, I did find songs in, for example, I mean, it's English language, it's Australia, but you have these things in French, in German. If you look hard enough, you're going to find them. They're like the Darwin anniversaries, which, I mean, that's how I got into it, right? 1959 was I was working on, in 1993, the big Darwin bicentennial. And now, many years later, people work on anniversaries and celebrations, music from about as many national contexts as there are researchers to dig into archives. So I think you could probably do the same with music, and we're probably not going to do enough with it today. So there is this global perspective, but I was really interested in the communities, what they were saying, and as I looked at it, it went everywhere from celebration to parody and satire in the way of alleviating anxieties, because I was working primarily with evolution, which generated both amusement and anxiety in a lot of people. So and then there are songs of resistance, anti-evolution songs. I found all these songs in the archives, like in Dayton, Tennessee, written specifically for the accompanying the circus-like atmosphere in Dayton, Tennessee, surrounding the Scopes monkey trial. And then I learned a lot about music, the history of music and music in America, because evolution and Darwin became, coded into monkeys, and monkeys were coded into African Americans, so that I was actually doing research in minstrel shows, blackface. I knew nothing about this as a historian of evolution, and it was like this whole world opened up to me. So I can't say it was. I think as I think of what Asif was saying, it was not my passion for a song or for music per se. It was whatever drives me as a historian to get at circulation of knowledge. And I love the element of surprise. I just love that as a researcher, but especially as a teacher. And if you can read Tennyson in memoriam to students before you teach them Darwin, nature red in tooth and claw, so they can understand the kind of context that gives rise to Darwinian evolutionary theory, and they go, I didn't expect to see it in poetry, right? I love that. I feel very satisfied as a scholar, but I mean, just as that's me. So it wasn't the love of the song. And incidentally, I did train in music, which really helped me. It helped me a lot, so that, and I do, I am a culture vulture, and it's not just song and music, it's videos, I love film. And I don't know why we can't use all of these expressions, I don't know what to call them, humanistic cultural expressions, in our research and in our teaching as historians of science. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's mostly in response to Asif, because I think I come at it from a different place.
Yeah, I think that that's very helpful. And now, yes, Tony, what would you like to say?
Well, just listening to both of you, Betty and Asif, I was also thinking about the songs that I'd come across as a form of social performance. But I think it's interesting what you said, Asif, about the way in which we need to keep our distance as historians, because a song is both, we have the record of a song, but there's the performance. And the performance at a particular time and moment, has its own meaning. And sometimes when I'm looking at things from the 19th century, I have to sort of assume one of the things that you mentioned, Betty, is that a lot of these songs have this humorous aspect of them. And if there's something that is hard to grasp as a historian, is what is funny in 1830 may not be as funny in 2023, right? So trying to understand the joke, I think, is part of the way in which we have to maintain that distance as historians, and can at the same time use that as to give us some insight about what it means to be part of a community, participating in a performance, coming all in for the chorus together. That moment has more meaning than just the words or the notation of the music. I think that's something that maybe we have to keep in mind.
That's great. Yeah, so thinking about it, I think thinking about issues of performance, thinking about issues of humor can be very helpful in terms of especially getting us into some of the particular challenges to working with some of these sources. Asif, you now have an opportunity to respond, and maybe if you want to talk some more about some of those challenges that you see.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, this is very interesting. I I do think, especially, sort of the way Betty was articulating the notion of what we use as sources is a important question. You asked about the barriers to working with songs in the history of science. I think, as a historian of science, most of us are trained to look at the production, the production of knowledge, scientific knowledge. We look at practices, rituals, structures, institutions, inequalities, all this other stuff associated with that process. But songs are not, at least in the traditional sense of the word, bundles of knowledge. They can be, but that is not their principal goal because they're first and foremost aesthetic objects. Uh, you're not thinking about other deeper sort of structural issues, maybe. Um, so as a historian of science, you have to how you navigate these poles between looking at something and as an aesthetic object, but also as an archive for, let's say, a history of science project is an interesting one to me because you have to navigate certain ways. You have to maybe unlearn certain things, as Betty said. You want to validate the song because it's maybe such a great song, but deconstructing the song also requires a little bit of demystification for the very reason you might have been drawn to the song in the first place. I also think that there's another kind of barrier that I've been thinking about, and that's maybe within the history of science itself, where we have a kind of hierarchy. It's an unspoken one, where I think if you are, I sense that if you are using songs, as a form of either as an object of study or as an archive. It's perhaps seen as maybe frivolous to the real task at hand for the historians of science, the real historians of science, of addressing the problems of, I don't know, knowledge and power and these kinds of important issues. I fear that if we have a panel about songs and science at the next HSS, it might be seen as less serious. I don't agree with that, but I sense as I was talking to people preparing for this podcast that some people thought it was funny and kind of a silly little thing we're going to do. But I think there are ways in which all of this is very serious stuff also, and I would like to put in a word for that aspect of it.
Yeah, I want to speak to that. Well, first of all, the aesthetic. It depends on what you mean by aesthetic, because this isn't pretty. A lot of my songs are not pretty, and I have songs from Dayton, Tennessee that evoke images of the KKK. Ma at Pa, he put on his sheet, and they're evoking the KKK. A lot of the songs from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that are rock are angry. They're expressing, they're saying we're animalistic. There's nothing pretty about Pearl Jam's "Do the Evolution," which is really nasty, critical commentary on human beings. In the when was it written? Was it the late 20th century or early 20th century? I used it. I used it in one of my Darwin performances. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's pretty. I think, and it's in terms of aesthetic, I personally views music in general, and putting songs to music even more so perhaps, as emotion. Song, it can also be a call to arms. Song can motivate people at a time of extreme just suffering, or doing battle, going into combat. People who are dying, they will people who go to sleep, right? The lullaby is a kind of a song. So when we're talking about songs in general, they're performing they're not just performing. To me, it's more of an expression of the human condition. We have songs for practically everything. So there's an emotion there, at least. And again, it's probably because I'm not working with a song. Some of them are funny, some of them are silly, but some of them are not pretty at all, not pleasing to the ear. They express pain. Then I've got these modern songs that are gangster rap, that are again, resistance and anger expressed in them. So I think, when we talk about song, we got to sort of think about, the generalities of what is it that they where do they come from? What is it that they explore? Tony, do you want to speak to that? You were nodding.
I don't have a great point. I was thinking about my own the song that I was selecting for this and the sort of the function that is served, but maybe we can come back to that later. I'm not sure that this is the best point for it.
Yeah, that sounds fine. So just going back to a particular piece, so thinking about Pearl Jam's "Do the Evolution," so that was from 1998. Um, that particular single was released. Yeah. But so I think it's interesting, sort of the extent to which, yeah, we're absolutely, our conversation is getting beyond thinking about songs as being silly or frivolous, like Asif was talking about, and definitely sort of in different kinds of ways talking about the different kinds of things that they could mean if we take them critically more seriously. Um, I thought it was useful also thinking about these categories of like celebration and anxiety that you've been talking about, Betty. That's something that I see especially coming up in a lot of math songs in the US. Even before the coining of such a thing as math anxiety, there were certainly songs long before that that were expressing anxiety about mathematical topics, as well as celebrating. And what's interesting is that those kinds of things can happen in the same song as well. Um, Moving on a little bit, so Betty, so thinking about some of the different kinds of ways that you've come to encounter some of these songs, so what are some of the ways that you've noticed them, and what are some of the challenges to working with some of the ephemera that songs might be sort of representing for us?
Well, the first challenge, Asif already mentioned it in passing, I think, and that is the resistance of your colleagues who don't necessarily take it seriously. And again, I think it's easier now, Asif, to be. I mean, I open copies of Isis, I open Osiris, and I see people talking about science fiction. Oh my heavens! 1990, you were going to mix science fiction with the history of science. The only person who did that was Donna Haraway. And Donna Haraway was like super controversial as a historian of science, right? So the first point of resistance is, yeah, this is serious work. Yeah, this is historical work. And let's ask the question, why is it that you can use a text that's in an archive and you cannot use a wax cylinder recording that is in, let's say, an archive of recordings? A wax cylinder was the way that people, they were kind of like in the days of the gramophone, or these tinfoil recordings that have this weird sound to them. And they've now been preserved, actually, and you can get your hands on them in internet archives. So, I mean, that's another point, Andy, I want to make. You can actually get your hands on a lot of things that it was much harder 20 years ago or 30 years ago. There's more available to us to access. So I don't know why we would not explore sounds, music. All of this is part of the doing of science or the practicing of science. As historians of science, there are some. First of all, it's incredibly fun. I want to note that, because you could go to an antique store Here outside of Florida, we have one, Micanopy, and you can find something like this, Abadabba Honeymoon. Do you see this piece of sheet music? You can get this for next to nothing in an antique store, or better still, you can get on eBay. Now that we have this marvelous historical tool that's a secret, we don't talk about this. We can actually get all kinds of interesting things on eBay that we might be able to use in our research or similar kinds of sources. So, it can be fun, but it's hard to work with them because there's copyright issues, and I still haven't sorted through that one. And as we're trying to figure out how we're going to handle this for this podcast. What can we do? We've had conversations about it. So I think the copyright, the property issues, are all part of it. Plus the fact that how do you? It's always reassuring as a historian if somebody can find it, so that you can cite it and they can go back and they can look at it. And you can't do that easily when it's in your hands, when you're the archive. And maybe that's something that we want to talk about, because the exciting thing is the whole concept of archive. What will count as an archive, right? Is comes to the fore. I think we can talk about that, because an archive is not just what's at the Regenstein Library at the University of Chicago, which is where I got a lot of the Darwin Centennial materials. It can be an antique store, it can be eBay, it can be these marvelous internet archives that are now available to us. So working with ephemera is, I think many of us have encountered both the joys and the challenges of working with that. And if you do anything with popular culture, chances are it's going to be working with ephemera.
Yeah, I am wondering if this is a good opportunity, Tony, for you to bring in a particular song that you want us to consider.
Well, sure. When you're dealing with songs that come from somewhat informal context, sometimes you end up with somewhat partial information. And the song that I immediately thought of when invited to be on this podcast was a song from the late 1830s by Edward Forbes, who was a naturalist. He was originally from the Isle of Man, and he wrote a very famous song. We only have the lyrics, an ode to the dredge, or a song about the dredge. So I have encountered this text many times, but there is no notation that dates back to Forbes, at least. In graduate school, my housemate and I made up our own version of this, which hopefully will work its way into this podcast. And a shout out to now Dr. Michael Schrimpf, who's an ornithologist, but also a musician, and helped me make that recording. But what's interesting about that song is again, I think it's the understanding it as a performance that took place among a small circle of young naturalists in the 1830s, and it's an ode to an instrument, which I think is kind of interesting. So it's an ode to a dredge, which in the 1830s would not have been a really standard scientific tool. It would have been more of a fishing instrument. And Edward Forbes is associated with the effort to standardize the practice of dredging. And he actually was involved in petitioning the British Association for the Advancement of Science to create funding for the use of dredging, standardize data reporting for the history for the dredging in British waters. So we can't understand Edward Forbes, the proponent of dredging, without inclusion of things like his song to the dredge. Because that's another way in which he was forming a community of practitioners around a particular instrument and a particular type of scientific collecting. So that is the main way in which I have sort of come across this in the 19th century in a way that really does, I think, inform our understanding of the history of the marine sciences.
Were you planning on singing some of that now, or?
I think if we could use the recording from when we already did it, which has concertina accompaniment, that would probably be better than me singing it to you now. Well, One other thing I'll just say, just to my earlier point, and I don't know if we want to work this in or not, but when we're trying, it on face value, a song can seem kind of obvious, have obvious meaning. I think the Song of the Dredge is an ode to the dredge. Hurrah for the dredge with its iron edge. But then there'll be occasional lyrics where, if you think about it a little bit more, maybe you realize you don't quite understand the meaning, because he talks about the dredge with its mystical triangle. So the mystical triangle is the metal opening to the dredge. A dredge is a net, by the way, that you pull along the seafloor and you pull things up. But as you probably know, with a triangle, the mystical triangle has this long history associated with alchemy. So what does that mean to Edward Forbes, talking about the mystical triangle in association with the dredge? I don't know. And that's one of the interesting questions that comes up when you look at his songs as opposed to his more formal scientific writing.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so Betty, what would you like to say?
Well, I mean, this is a good time to come in and bring in yet another genre. Let's call them genres. All these sample come back to Asif, since I've been looking at different kinds of songs. There's a whole genre of songs that scientists write, right? For themselves as a way of enduring sometimes terrible circumstances, making fun of themselves, but also, I think, more seriously, as a way of belonging, right? Creating this kind of community for themselves. The inside joke. Remember, we talked about this at the beginning. Is it funny? Are you part of the community? Can you get the joke? So I have a compilation of these songs, and very often one of the reasons that they're very funny is that there's the song, which consists of not original lyrics, but taking some well known song and the music and then changing the lyrics around. So it's a long way to Tipperary becomes the Amphioxus song. And we can actually, I have recordings of that and I can play it for you. But it's sung at marine biological stations, like at Woods Hole, for example. So there are, and then there are songs, science songs for children, kind of along the way of teaching them. Remember, what was it? The Muppet, not the Muppets. It was a PBS production that had all these grammar rock for children. It's like science rock for children, and I've got recordings of that, like Introduction to the Fossils and Eohippus. So they're teaching children perhaps not to be afraid, to be comfortable with some of the aspects of science. And the electric company, yeah, that might have been it. So there is, and that's Asif, that's where you get into the really funny, and not just an evolution. There was a video that was made about, I love my PCR machine, and these were all these molecular biologists holding these machines that they use for genome sequencing. I mean, molecular biologists and geneticists can also come up with some very funny kinds of things, but funny songs and videos and so on. I do think it's part of belonging to the community, Tony. And I have to tell you, I'm sorry, I just have to tell you this. It's too good. I just came back from a 20-day trip to the Antarctic on an expedition vessel. And do you know what we did on that vessel? We sang whaling songs and songs of expeditions, so that it's a different context. You're kidding yourself if you think Quark Expeditions is a kind of upscale ecotourist. Lots of science. The whole thing was a kind of scientific mission for retirees and young people who can afford it. But we sang those songs on those expeditions, exactly what you described.
Just Can I just add? I know, Betty, you brought up before that song is wonderful in teaching, and I've always wanted to do sea shanties with my students, but I never really brought up the courage to do it. But I had a wonderful teacher when I was an undergraduate, Dr. Mary Malloy, and she would just break out into song and in the middle of class in her maritime history classes, and It was amazing. But one of the wonderful things about sea shanties, I realize this is a little off topic, is that you can tell your students, these were working songs sung at sea on the open ocean by people who were probably not singing them in tune. Maybe some were, you sound fine if you join in. So maybe this year will be the year that I manage to get my students to do this.
I absolutely, Tony, I absolutely agree that using these songs, music in our teaching, and one of my kind of hidden motives when I do that for a lot of things is to introduce them to the actual music that they're never going to hear in all probability. I mean, if I have a class on science exploration and empire, and they're going to get, they get Scott of the Antarctic by Ray Vaughan Williams, and I do Bernard Hermann, Sinbad the Sailor. And they walk into the classroom and I tell them things like, picture this music. I mean, picture it. What does it evoke? And I don't tell them what it is, and I let them kind of figure it out. And this is before the class begins, so I don't have to feel guilty that I'm taking them away from, the actual what I have to teach that day. But it sure does work. Picture, you're teaching the Black Death, one of my lectures on the Black Death, and my students walk in and they're going to hear Saint-Saëns. They're going to hear Danse Macabre, because that's part of what comes out of the Black Death are these, musical traditions, right? The Danse Macabre is associated with, comes right out of the Black Death. And then I show them videos of skeletons dancing. They're on YouTube. So what you're doing is, it's bridging fields, but you're showing them how knowledge circulates, how humans come to terms with death, suffering, joy, belonging, all of the above, all of the human experience. But you're choosing the songs in such a way that they're connected to science or to that lecture.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. Helpful to think about the different kinds of ways that this can be really useful for historians of science to think about. So I was wondering, Asif, it's been a little while since we've heard from you. If you'd like to go back and maybe talk a little bit about sampling, which you had mentioned previously, and also if there's a particular example that you'd like to have us consider as well.
Sure, yeah. Sampling, I think I mentioned it earlier. Um, especially sampling of what we might call sounds of nature and those sorts of things, but also sampling other noises has been a part of music, late 20th century music for a long time. Everybody knows the song Blackbird by the Beatles, which begins with an actual blackbird singing. And those kinds of things have been common. I think I some of the first real music that was built just through sampling was in the late 70s, early 80s. There's an album called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts that David Byrne worked on, and Brian Eno. And I had the fortune of interviewing David Byrne for a piece I wrote on that album, which about how sampling worked in his worldview and how he thought about it, particularly because for that album, actually, they were sampling sounds from old anthropology records made in the 70s. There was a particular album called Music in the World of Islam, in which they recorded certain voices in the Middle East. Anyway, they were repurposing all those voices in their new album with modern electronic beats. So there was this whole question of cultural appropriation. So sampling, I think, brings up these very difficult issues. And I would be remiss not to mention the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is another organization that I've been very interested in, which was, I think they started in the late 1950s. They were one of the first really organizations to think about sampling and to repurpose found noise. So the sound of a rock falling or waterfalls or voices and so forth, they would sort of repurpose that kind of music through pitch shifting, reversing, or distorting, and so forth. And a number of very famous electronic music composers, such as Delia Derbyshire, and others came through that. And they also were the ones who authored the theme music for the show Doctor Who. So that's also their claim to fame. But the song that I wanted to actually talk about was actually it is by the Icelandic artist Björk, who was very much influenced by all of this, including the BBC Radiophonic Workshop by David Byrne and others. She has a song called Cosmogony, which, as most of us know, which is the science of the study of the origins of the universe. It's kind of a meditation on the Big Bang and so forth. And she sings quite plaintively about the origins, but she she samples a lot of different sounds. She sort of, this is an allusion to the music of the spheres, right, where there's a kind of relationship between the movement of the planets and planetary bodies and certain sounds that are supposedly being formed, certain tones. And this theory goes back to, I think, antiquity. Kepler has written about it most famously. But Björk takes that idea and makes this really beautiful, wondrous song that also inverts and rethinks the Big Bang itself and playfully suggests that the Big Bang theory itself might be something that we rethink, And she says, um, back then our universe was an empty sea until a silver fox and her cunning mate began to sing a song that became the world we knew. So she suggests that maybe science itself yeah, has to see other ways and of being, so forth. So I found that kind of interesting, both as an object of sampling, but also as a commentary on the history of science itself, which is very interesting for an artist who very much traffics in this particular world of science, technology, and art. So that was one thing that I really was eager to share.
Well, just on the topic of sampling, what comes to mind, and it's interesting that there's some other work going on in sampling in the 1970s, but the 1970s in the world of marine science is when there's a new understanding of marine mammal intelligence, and a lot of that it comes from sampling whale song. I'm sure you're familiar. Roger Payne is the biologist who's associated with this. He produces an LP of the songs of the humpback whale, which is very popular, and my parents had it, I realized later in life. But he was also actively trying to get artists to work with his recordings as well, which I think is kind of interesting. So Judy Collins was a songwriter who took some of his Roger Payne's, I believe, Roger Payne's recordings of Humpback Whale and then worked them into her album, forgetting the titles, like Whales and Nightingales, something like that, where she's mixed whale song and an old whaling shanty in one recording. So to get back to our history of science topic, I think it is interesting to think about songs as a way that we can see community building beyond the silos of scientists only communicating with other scientists. And music is a bridge of communication between different social worlds as well.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I think it's just sort of amazing the extent to which we're finding all kinds of things to talk about here, from aesthetics to community to some of the particular difficulties to working with ephemera or humor, and various questions of studying something that might seem silly but still should be taken seriously in different kinds of ways. Um, so I was wondering if we could sort of move to wrap up, actually, around now, um, and just sort of see if each of you could talk a little bit about how you'd most like to see historians of science taking up songs in their work. So this could be in terms of research, which we've been talking about already, teaching, which we've also mentioned, or maybe some other sorts of ways as well. Um, does anyone want to start us off?
Well, I'm just going to continue doing what I've been doing, and I think the fact that we're having this podcast, the fact that this is, that we're coming together in this way, is a kind of confirmation or affirmation, maybe better, that this is something we should do. That I think historians of science have already started taking advantage of media. Let's just call it various cultural media. And on that note, I don't want to end without showing you my copy of the original Darwin musical written for the 1959 anniversary. Thank you, Bert Hansen. He pointed it out to me, wrote to me, and said, here's the record. And believe it or not, what came with it was like, I'm so lucky. It's the whole libretto and the actual program. And so, this comes back to this notion of archive. Look at this. I'd have to go to Chicago to get it. And I don't think they actually have the record album, but my intention is to play some of this music for you that, reenacts the whole of the Darwin story in musical form. And that's another discussion. That's one of the ways that music and song, um, you know, are featured in the history of science. But the quick answer from me, Andy, is I'm just going to do what I've always done, and I just hope maybe somebody's listening who's going to feel encouraged and emboldened to to use this. I mean, let's if you're kind of scared about doing it, do it in your teaching first. See how it works with your classes, and then think about how you can integrate it in your research. I did publish an article in ISIS on it. So, and that was 2009 for the occasion of the big anniversary.
Thank you. Excellent. So, Asif, it looks like you have something.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to echo what Betty said, maybe add a couple of small things. I think, yeah, I would really urge historians of science to think about songs as a kind of archive, both in telling stories, but as a form, a chronicle of a particular moment, um, as a kind of um sonic historiography, right? I guess for of a moment, because songs function much like scholarship, right? Songs cite previous songs, and or they quote previous songs, or they echo previous songs. They produce new meaning. Some songs endure, some songs are forgotten. So I wonder if there's ways for historians of science to think of songs as a possible archive of knowledge. But more, I think the thing that I wanted to add was because as my interests are turning to the history of science in the history of colonialism, I wonder if there's a way in which makes sense to think about songs also as a site of intersection between science and colonialism, and how certain colonial sensibilities persist into the current day in songs. I think songs provide a kind of uh, thick description of the ways in which cultures in contact come into contact with each other, and it might be useful to investigate the presence of certain songs as sites for people making meaning out of the world that we study, especially the landscapes where modern science came into contact with colonial practices and so forth. Because I think there's a lot that we're not getting through the conventional archival method, and so I think there's deeper truths maybe embedded in songs if we look for them, that is, in music. It's not an easy thing to do because obviously we don't have no recordings, but there's certainly in the history of slavery and so forth, there's a long and distinguished tradition of imbuing and seeking meaning in song and music and so forth. So I think we should not shy away from those paths.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I think one of the things about thinking about songs as being about a connection to communities is that you can think about sort of the senses of belonging, but you can also think about sort of the people who are excluded from communities. And I think it would be helpful to point out some of the racist iconography on some of the sheet music that Betty was holding up before. Um, that's an important piece of this as well, right?
Can you hold this up? And I don't know if you can see the details. This is exactly what I mean, what you're talking about. The figure in the middle looks like Abraham Lincoln. And, if we can reproduce this, it's actually in ISIS. I published it in ISIS. It's a piece of sheet music, and you can see these monkeys encircling, and there's an African American man talking to looks like it's a big ape like female, but this thing is it's really appalling. Now you could say it's visual representation and not really music, but it's connected to lyrics. And then the other thing, Andy, what's really important, one of the things that I learned in the process of working on this, that you've got the visual, you've got the lyrics, and then you have the actual music as a historian. And you've got to know something about ethnomusicology. It's not easy because it's really a lot you have to know and think about, because a lot of this music has all these drums in the background, and these references to deepest darkest Africa and Darwin. I mean, all the stuff that they're bringing together, and you have to know the actual, be able to analyze the music to see what messages and signals are being conveyed with the music accompanying the lyrics. So it takes, I mean, we need a lot of work to be done in this area. I'm very serious about that. And, collaborations maybe with ethnomusicologists. Why not?
Yeah. Just on that point, you have both made excellent points already, but maybe we can look at music in the history of science and find some inspiration for our present era, where scientists were able to communicate outside of their own silos, and I think historians need to do so as well, with increasing urgency. And part of that, one piece of that puzzle, is figuring out more accessible ways to teach and use music as another way of bringing students in and to engage them with material in new ways. But also maybe we should be thinking about the history of music and science as something that could inspire us to think about how we communicate our own work as well. I don't know if that means we should be all singing songs together, but maybe, thinking about other forms of media expression or collaborations, as you pointed out, Betty, thinking about interdisciplinary collaborations. I think that's something that we can draw from this.
And one of the things about this History and Philosophy of Science songbook that I was sent is sort of pointing out, I mean, I'm not sure if on that occasion, so that was distributed on the occasion of the beginning of the HSS conference in Bloomington in 1985. I'm not sure if those song books were just distributed or if they were actually, people actually sang any songs from them. But it is the case that, I mean, this is something that it seems like has happened in the past. So it is possible to take some inspiration from things that have happened before to see the kinds of things we want to do now. Okay, so would anyone like to conclude? Is there anything else that you want to make sure to say?
No, I want to thank you, Andy, for all the work you've done uh, putting this together. I mean, it really is. You, you really organized the group. Thank you, and thank Babak Ashrafi and CHSTM for putting the podcast, and Fatih Fan, who's behind this project, Tony and Asif. And it's been a total pleasure working with you and preparing for this as well.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who I've met, but also definitely Andy and Babak and Fatih, of course. Yeah, the preparation was really good, hence the execution was also good. So